In our environment, we see diverse life forms. We see plants, animals, microorganisms, and much more. They are different groups and have different characteristics. This variety of life forms in a region forms the biodiversity. Welcome to the lesson on classification of living organisms. Of the lesson, we will be able to explain the need for classification of living organisms, explain the history of the classification of living organisms, describe organisms using the 5 kingdom classification systems, classify organisms into subgroups based on hierarchical classification system. Understand and explain the names of organisms using binomial nomenclature. There is a vast number of living organisms in this biosphere, and they have a great diversity in shape, size, and form. Hence, we group the related organisms to study evolutionary relationships and to identify them. We see range of variations in life forms around us. For example, variation in size. Bacteria is microscopic, while a blue whale is more than 30 meters long. Variation in longevity. Mosquitoes are alive for a few days, but a pine tree can exist up to several thousand years. Aristotle classified animals according to whether they lived on land, in water, or in the air. This is a very simple way of looking at life, but misleading too. For example, animals that live in the sea include corals, whales, octopuses, starfish, and sharks. They are different from each other in many things like structure and food habits. The only thing which is common among them is their habitat. What shall be the basis of developing a hierarchy in classification? For this, we need to decide which characteristics should be used to make groups. Characteristic is a particular form or a particular function. For example, most of the animals have 5 fingers on each hand. This is a characteristic. A man can run, but a banyan tree cannot. This is also a characteristic. The method of arranging organisms into groups or sets on the basis of similarities and differences is called classification. The science of classification is known as taxonomy. There are many advantages of classification of living organisms. Classification makes the study of a wide variety of organisms easy. The study of a few organisms from each class gives a broad idea of the life as a whole. Classification gives information about the organisms which do not occur in one's locality. Classification reveals evolution trends by showing gradually increasing complexity of structure in various groups of organisms. All living things are identified and categorized on the basis of their body design in relation to their form and function. Characteristics that came into existence earlier are likely to be more fundamental than characteristics that have come into existence later. Hence, the classification of life forms is closely related to their evolution. Charles Darwin first described the idea of evolution in 1859 in his book The origin of species. Biologists such as Ernst Haeckel, Robert Whittaker, and Carl Woese have tried to classify all living organisms into broad categories called kingdoms. Carolus Linnaeus classified organisms into Plantae and Animalia. Ernst Haeckel proposed Protista to include eukaryotic unicellular organisms. Later on, Monera and Fungi were included in the classification as new kingdoms. The classification kingdoms are formed on the basis of cell structure, mode, and source of nutrition and body organization. Classification is done by naming the subgroups of various levels. Animal kingdom is further grouped into phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Upon grouping organisms on the basis of a hierarchy of characteristics, we arrive at the basis unit of classification, which is a species. A species includes all organisms that are similar enough to breed and flourish. Let us now study the 5 kingdoms in detail. Monera includes bacteria, blue-green algae, and cyanobacteria and mycoplasma. They do not have a defined nucleus or organelles, and they do not show multicellular body designs. The mode of nutrition of organisms in this group can be either by synthesizing their own food, that is, autotrophic, like in blue-green algae, or getting it from the environment, that is, heterotrophic, like in bacteria. Protista includes unicellular algae, diatoms, and protozoan like euglena, amoeba, and paramecium. Their mode of nutrition can be autotrophic or heterotrophic. They are unicellular and simpler form of eukaryotic organisms. Some of these organisms use appendages such as hair-like cilia or whip-like flagell for moving around. Includes mushrooms. These are the heterotrophic eukaryotic organisms. These organisms are not plants, hence they are not capable of performing photosynthesis. They use decaying organic material as food and are therefore called saprophytes. Many of the fungi have the capacity to become multicellular organisms at certain stages in their lives. They have cell walls made up of a tough, complex sugar called chitin. Kingdom Plantae include all multicellular eukaryotes with cell walls made up of cellulose. They are autotrophic and use chlorophyll for photosynthesis. Animalia is the largest of all kingdoms in terms of species. These include all organisms which are multicellular eukaryotes without cell walls. They are heterotrophic and get their food from the environment. Conventions are followed while writing scientific names. The name of the genus begins with a capital letter. The name of the species begins with a small letter. When printed, the scientific name is given in italics. When written by hand, the genus name and the species name have to be underlined separately. In the lesson, you are able to explain the need for classification of living organisms. Explain the history of the classification of living organisms. Describe organisms using the 5 kingdom classification systems. Classify organisms into subgroups based on hierarchical classification system. Understand and explain the names of organisms using binomial nomenclature.